This is Rock and Roll English. Real people, real English. Here's your host, Martin Johnston.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Rock and Roll English, episode number 281, baby. Oh yeah. In today's episode, I speak to another podcaster, and it's a kind of strange episode in some ways because Craigh from Inlges Podcast, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, contacted me and we decided to record a podcast for both of our podcasts. So our conversation you can listen to here on Rock and Roll English and also Craigh's podcast, Inlges Podcast, which there will be links to in the show notes. Now, we speak about storytelling again, and before you think, oh, not again, because admittedly I have made quite a few podcasts about this recently, we look at it from a different angle. Some technical stuff about what makes a good story, what doesn't. We both share some funny stories. I share a story which I don't think I've ever shared on the podcast that involved me being naked with one of my male students. And we even talk about how to eat spaghetti in Italy. So it really is a fantastic episode. But before we start, remember my pronunciation and storytelling course is starting today. There are no places left, but I will be doing it again in probably about 2 months. So if you go to rockandrollenglish.com/fluency, you can find all of the details there. But that's enough of me talking. I will speak to you very briefly at the end. But in the meantime, happy listening.
Well, Martin, it's really good to talk to you, and we're going to look today at different ways of storytelling because I think we're both interested in storytelling. But before we do that, can you clarify something for me? Can you clear something up?
Sure.
So recently I did a podcast about table manners and eating habits. And I know you spent a lot of time living in Italy and Sicily, so you obviously know the culture. The question was, do Italians tend to eat spaghetti with just a fork? Because I've always used a spoon and a fork. And I did Google, before you say to me, Craigh, you idiot, why haven't you Googled this? I have, and let me quote you an expert on Italy called Martina Landwerman. Doesn't sound particularly Italian, but let's go with it. Martina says, and I quote, "Absolutely not. Eating spaghetti with a spoon will, at least, be met with double takes from locals." And a double take is where you're very surprised and you look at things twice. What's even worse, says Martina, is cutting it with a knife. Etiquette dictates we only use the fork and the plate. Martin, please clarify this.
I'm 100% with, is it Martina? You said we've even got similar names actually. So yeah, I'm 100% with her on this because when I first went to Italy, I did actually cut spaghetti, and then I realised very soon that I was going to get kicked out of the country unless I changed my habits quickly. And yeah, the spoon thing, people just look at you like you're a bit of an idiot. I suppose it would be like an adult with a bike with stabilizers on still. So stabilizers being when you're a child and you have those extra wheels to stop you falling off.
Yeah.
They would just look at you like, how has this person not learnt how to eat spaghetti? What an idiot. That would be the spoon, whilst the cutting would be like, let's call the police and get this person out of the country as soon as possible. So now I obviously don't use a spoon or a knife, just the fork. And
how do you curl the spaghetti around the fork then if you haven't got a spoon to lean it against?
Well, so first of all, you need to get the spaghetti, move the other spaghetti away, create like almost a corner in the plate. And so instead of the spoon, you kind of use the bottom of the plate to do that. So that's the technique. And yeah, sometimes actually when friends came to visit me and we would go out for dinner and they would be using a spoon or using a knife, and I would think, oh, look at these idiots. Whilst I wouldn't, and I would feel so proud. I'd be like, I am so good at eating spaghetti. So yeah, 12 years in Italy, that's the best thing I learned, I suppose, was how to eat spaghetti.
Well, at least you came away with something. So that's something you can take with you wherever you go. No, thanks for clearing that up, because I couldn't find that on Uncle Google. So you've helped us a lot, and I will make sure that our listeners know that, as you've heard it.
Take some time, practice. Like anything, practice is the key. Doesn't happen overnight, but once you get there, it's a wonderful thing. Believe me, Craig, it's a wonderful thing. It's
a bit like storytelling in a way, isn't it? How's that for a transition? Let's move on to storytelling, which does need practice. Now, you've recently had some very interesting episodes on your podcast about storytelling. Was it episode 279 with David Heathfield, which was the most recent?
Correct, yeah. So that was just a few days ago, yeah.
Yeah, definitely worth listening to that if you haven't already. And obviously my listeners may not have, so we'll give you details at the end of where you can find that. And also one I very much enjoyed was with Adrian Underhill, speaking about pronunciation and storytelling. And do you remember the episode number for that?
The number, I'm not so sure, to be honest. It's fairly recent. I'm going to guess it 276-ish, something like that. Yeah, I do kind of lose count of the numbers. So yeah, I would guess around that.
Right. So in those two episodes, on Martin's podcast, you can really have a deep dive and learn lots of information about storytelling. And also on Inlges Podcast, episode 137, How to Tell a Story in English, looks more at the mechanics from a grammar standpoint and other features of English, how to put a story together in English. That might be useful. But today we're talking about why are some stories and anecdotes boring? What makes it difficult to tell stories in a second language? So for you, how can you improve your storytelling? And how can you be a good listener when you're listening to a story in English? So let's look at the first one, Martin. Why are some stories and anecdotes boring? Can you remember hearing people tell really boring stories and thinking, oh God, what is this person going on about?
Yes, I can. And I think the reason is just because I think the common question people ask themselves when you're listening to a story of just, where is this actually going? Like, it needs to be funny, or it needs to be emotional. It needs to inspire you. It needs to give you some kind of emotion. But if it's just, for example, I went to the supermarket and then the cashier didn't have the correct change, and then she had to ask someone, and then I had to wait, and then they gave me the correct change, then that's not really giving me any kind of emotion. So I suppose that would be, in my opinion, to actually think about what you want the other person to feel and focus on that, because otherwise it's just going nowhere. So what's the point in actually telling someone if there's no emotion to the story? It's just a waste of everyone's time.
Exactly. And I always think of my dad when I think about boring stories, because my dad used to give too much detail, and he'd say, "You'd never guess what happened to me yesterday." "What happened, Dad?" "Well, I woke up at 8 o'clock, which is unusual because usually I wake up at 7:15. But yesterday I didn't set my..." And he goes off on a tangent. He talks about something that's not connected to the story. So of course you're going to get bored. Stick to the story and make sure you're hitting the important points of the story.
I totally agree. An example of that, I remember specifically, I even remember the exact pub I was in, and looking at this person that was telling a story who... when you go to the pub sometimes and you're with some friends and then the table kind of gets bigger, some other people just join, like friends of friends. And this person was telling us a story. And I remember he said, so 2 years ago at Christmas, was it 2 years ago? No, I think it was 3. No, you're right. It was 3 because my first child hadn't been born there. And I was thinking I could not give a monkey's about if it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago. The story's boring enough anyway. So this detail here, when you're getting confused in your head and having a conversation with yourself, is just totally irrelevant. So please just hurry up and let's get this over with.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we've all met people like that. And one thing that Adrian Underhill said on your podcast was the importance of speaking slowly and pausing. And I think that is such fantastic advice. And I've been using that with my students online to help them with disfluencies so that they're speaking slowly, they're pausing, because pausing can be so effective. Do you see what I did there?
I did. That was nice.
It makes so much sense, but sometimes people just try to speak too quickly and all disfluencies creep in and appear in their speech. And yeah,
I totally agree. And that's something, since I did that course with Adrian, that I also have been trying to work on, because so many times you just speak without actually thinking. And a classic example maybe as well as teachers, where I think the technical term for it is echoing, of basically just saying what you're thinking. So let's say I want to write something on the board and then the pen falls on the floor and I say, oh, the pen's on the floor, let me just pick this up. Oh, 1 second. And all of these words that are coming out are irrelevant. It's like my friend, let's call him, that was telling me about whether it happened 2 years ago or 3 years ago. It's totally irrelevant. So I think one of the big things, though, is being comfortable with silence, of just taking the pause. So, for example, in that moment, let's say you drop a pen. If you've got nothing actually to say at that point, just silence. I think it takes a lot of guts, a lot of courage to do that sometimes, because people don't like silences, so they just try to fill in the gaps with words which don't mean anything, and it's just basically your mouth moving, because there's no communication happening. It's just words coming out with no meaning. So yeah, that's definitely something I'm trying to work on as well.
Me too, absolutely. And I'll add to that, because you've got a background with Italian speakers, I've got a background with Spanish speakers, even though we both teach people of different nationalities. But do you agree that Italian speakers, and I definitely think that Spanish speakers and most people from the southern Mediterranean area don't feel comfortable with silence, not as much as Northern Europeans and Scandinavians. They're much more comfortable not speaking, whereas Spanish speakers, especially in social situations, they think silence is not comfortable and they feel the need to fill it with something. Is that your experience in Italy?
Yeah, I would say so, but I think it also depends on the person. If I think of my mother-in-law, for example, there's just literally never a quiet moment. But there are some people, but I suppose in general, maybe.
Does she listen to this podcast, Martin?
Luckily, no. Although she has just literally started an English course, but like level 1 stuff. So she might listen to this in a few years.
Okay. By which time you'll know how to sort of deflect any criticism.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the second question that we want to discuss. What makes it difficult to tell stories in a second language? Because I think it may be more difficult for people learning English to tell stories than a native speaker. What do you think?
Yeah, of course. I think obviously vocabulary, number one. But one of the things I think, so from my personal experience of telling stories in Italian or telling stories in English, would be using like colloquial language, so which has more of an effect that maybe you don't know in the other language. So, for example, I don't know, if I was telling a story and I might use a word like Then we went back to his gaff. So gaff being slang for like house.
Yeah.
But that would have that would be quite funny to do. Using these kind of words can be very funny and make the story more interesting, or maybe using an expression. I remember one of my friends at the end of a story once using the expression in for a penny, in for a pound. So basically to say, if I'm doing this, a little bit, I'm going to do it properly. But those kind of things, I think, really do add a lot to the story, because something maybe which isn't so funny, if said using some of this language, that immediately makes it hilarious. Sometimes even just the word is hilarious. But when I was speaking Italian, I didn't often know these slang words, so I would just use the normal words, and so my story would have less impact. So that's what I found. But how about you, Craig?
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And another thing I took away from your interview with Adrian was he mentioned having a performance piece, which kind of speaks to what you're saying, that if you're going to tell a story and it's a good story, or it might be a joke, spend some time researching those kind of expressions to enhance it, to make it better and funnier and more entertaining to the listener. And you really only need a few. If you're in a social situation and you have like 2 or 3 jokes or 2 or 3 funny stories, you can pull them out of the hat, I could say, and you've spent some time practicing them. And I really like that idea, not only for people learning English, but for me as well. So I've started to do it. I've started to think of stories that I could tell in certain situations. How would I tell it? I don't want to put any extra information in, like we said before, to make it boring. I want to make sure the important points are there and they get across well, people understand them easily. So working on something, as Adrian said, a performance piece, like you would a presentation or a wedding speech, is really, really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. To have them kind of in your locker. And I did actually have a couple of them when I was in Sicily. And I actually added a few Sicilian terms, which, again, to me as a foreigner, using Sicilian made the story so much funnier. So when I told people that, they would erupt with laughter, basically because it sounded so strange for a foreigner to be using like Sicilian. So yeah, understanding some of that language can really add something to the story.
And another thing that I noticed, because you've said on a previous podcast that you really practiced your wedding speech so that you could deliver it as best that you can. And I remember I was best man years ago in the UK. I was co-best man. There were 2 of us. So
I've
guy
done that as well.
Have you?
Yeah.
This guy called Mark, who was co-best man with me at the wedding, we practiced our speech together because we delivered it together. So we practiced it in private. And I said my piece, my bit, and Mark says, "Okay, that's good, Craig. Just say it again without these ers and the ums and the ers." And I said, "What do you mean, Mark? I didn't say that." Yes, you did. And when I actually focused on how I was speaking, I noticed all these ers, ums, ahs in the middle. And sometimes native speakers and obviously language learners who need more time to think of vocabulary and grammar before they speak, they don't realize they're making these noises, and that can be a bit annoying and make the story less effective.
Absolutely. And again, I think it goes back to what we mentioned about silence, being comfortable with silence, because when you're not, that's what you tend to do, just throw in a like I just did there. Actually,
you did that on purpose though, didn't you? Or did
the first time I did, I think I did it twice. we can check on the recording. The first time was on purpose, then the second time no. But there we go. It is actually a normal thing to do. I think to eradicate it completely is difficult, but yes, certainly to be cautious of that, and especially if you're doing rehearsed speech or something like that, then you definitely want to get rid of them. But in spontaneous speaking, I think it's I keep noticing
you're really
now when
conscious
I do it.
of it now, aren't you?
Jesus, I can't stop now. I've got the disease.
Hey, don't worry, we're podcasters. We can remove this when we edit.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so in a like rehearsed speech, then it is definitely something to try to get rid of.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the last one was, how can you be a good active listener? I don't know if you remember maybe when you were first becoming quite proficient in Italian when you were living there. How did you listen? Do you remember if you made any noises, if you had any little words that you learned to keep the engagement so that the speaker felt that you were engaged in what they were saying? Any body language? Do you remember that far back?
I think I just went for the nodding and saying see, even at times when maybe I actually wasn't understanding what was happening, just to try to be polite.
I do that today as well still.
That's what I think my tactic was. But I think, though, to be a good active listener, the main thing, which is something, again, which I need to work on, and I try to, but to actually listen to what the other person says instead of just thinking about what you're going to say next, which is something I do a lot. And I especially notice this in the podcast, obviously, when I edit a podcast and the person I'm speaking to says something really interesting, and listening back to it, I can understand that I didn't actually listen because I didn't almost acknowledge what they just said and then just went immediately to whatever I wanted to say. This is something I think everyone does, but if you want to be a good listener, then to actually focus on what that person says. And again, going back to the silence thing, taking a second sometimes to digest and then actually respond. So that's what I think to be a good active listener. But what about you, Craig?
I'm taking my time before I respond here. But yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you interview people sometimes and they'll say something like, oh, I started my teaching business after my mum died. And you'd respond thinking, oh, yeah, that must be fantastic. That must have been fantastic for you. And you just don't listen and you don't respond correctly to what they've said. So, and there's a really good YouTube presentation. I can't remember who made it, and said, you hear advice like make good eye contact while you're listening, lean forward to show interest, especially in a job interview, nod, move your head up and down and nod, say things like, or repeat the last bit of the sentence. But really, as you said, the most important thing is to just listen. Just listen. Exactly. And then respond to what you're hearing. Be very active listeners is probably the best advice. You've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what I'd say. I remember when my wife is Spanish, and when we first started going out together and we were traveling together, she didn't speak very good English and she was a bit nervous about making conversation with other travelers. And I said, Angeles, it's really easy. All you've got to do when people are speaking to you is just say, lovely, oh, lovely, with this kind of intonation. And we met these Australians who had been on a disastrous river trip. They'd had really bad weather. The boat capsized. They got covered in mud. It was terrible. And Angeles was going, lovely. Oh, lovely. And they said, lovely? What do you mean lovely? It was terrible. So you have to be careful with your responses like that.
Yeah. My response at the moment, because in Italian, what they often do to say, like, you're right, yeah, they say infatti, which means, well, the translation, I suppose, would be in fact. Mm-hmm. So, like, when someone's talking, to emphasize you agree with them, they say infatti. So now when I'm speaking English, for some reason, I just say, in fact, which doesn't actually make any sense in English, but that's something I find myself doing quite a lot.
Have you stopped doing it yet? Because you've been outside of Italy for a while now, haven't you?
I need to actually double check. I think it's like the you don't notice it until you actually start talking about it. But I noticed I definitely did it a lot when I was working in Sicily with my English colleagues. But I need to see. Hopefully, I'm starting to get rid of it. But we will have to see. But yeah, so if I say in fact, don't be alarmed. It just means I'm listening and paying attention.
Well, that's good. I will point it out to you though, so that you can stop doing that. Yeah. Well, that was really interesting. Let's maybe finish with a stories of our own. I've got one here connected to teaching. Or if you want to go first, Martin, have you got a story?
No, absolutely not. I would love to hear your story.
Okay, well, I'll go first then, but you will tell yours after, you promise. You won't get out of it. Okay, so
No way.
I used to work for the British Council in Valencia. In fact, I was made redundant last year, and I'd been working for the British Council for 24 years, since 1997. Wow. Every Saturday morning during the academic year, I would be up at like 8 o'clock, 8:30. Imagine that, all those boring Friday nights to get up early on a Saturday for 24 years. The school opened at 9 o'clock and I started my classes at 9:30. So one particular Saturday, when I arrived at 9, there were police outside the school talking to the security guard, because we had a security guard on the door all the time. And I thought, hello, what's going on here? What's happening? Some kind of burglary or something? Now, we had 8 classrooms in the school, and Saturday morning was one of the most popular times. They were all full on Saturday. What happened was, on the Friday night before, just before the school closed, a man had entered the school. He'd sneaked past the security guard. If you sneak past, then you manage to not be seen and very quietly go into the building secretly. And he hid in one of the classrooms, and he was still there Saturday morning. And a colleague of mine found him sleeping on the floor in front of the whiteboard in the classroom, these really dirty clothes, smelling of alcohol. And the funny thing was, this teacher was a bit stuck up, which means he was a bit of a snob. Imagine a very formal, very strict upper class Cambridge or Oxford teacher. And to make matters worse, the guy had left a large poo in the corner of the class. And of all the teachers, this was the teacher to find it. And I just felt really sorry for the poor guy who may have been homeless. I don't know. He may have been living on the street. He had nowhere to sleep. But it was quite a story that many teachers are still talking about to this day.
But so they managed to get him out then. So he was in there, in the classroom still.
Yes.
With his poo.
With his poo, sleeping in the corner, and he was escorted out by the police. I don't know if he was arrested, but he was taken out of the building, and the poo remained in the classroom to greet the students at 9:30.
And so surely someone got rid of the poo before the lesson started. You can't do a lesson with a poo sitting in the corner of the classroom, surely.
Well, I'd heard, I don't think the students would have noticed, because most of them came straight from the class, from the disco or the club the night before. They were probably half asleep. But I heard after my class that the poo had been removed by one of the unfortunate cleaners. But the smell remained up until break time.
Oh.
So that's my poo story. Over to you, mate.
Right. Okay. Wow. Well, I didn't prepare anything before. I just thought, I will wait for you to tell a story and something will come to mind. And 2 stories have come to mind. The first one is kind of one of those probably boring anecdotes that I mentioned earlier, but it was a very strange experience that I want to share, which I don't think I have ever shared on a podcast. But so when I was living in Rome, I was teaching English at an important consulting firm, and I only worked with the directors and partners of the firm that were all really, really serious people. And it would be a 2-hour individual lesson. And it was so boring. But one of these people was crazy. I don't know how he had got to that position, because he was absolutely crazy. And normally lessons with him involved going out for 2 hours in the city centre, and he would normally take me to like a nice restaurant. I did have to listen to him telling me about all of the conquests, let's say, that he had in the week. So his lots of women, let's just say, that he would go into very specific detail with me about, which wasn't really necessary. But I was happy because I was eating in expensive restaurants. So again, I would just kind of nod up and down and say, in fact, quite a lot. And he was happy. But then one day he said to me, do you want to have a massage? And I was like, well, what, from you? Or and he said, no, let's go and have a massage, and then we'll have the lesson there. We can just talk whilst we're having a massage. And so I thought, well, why not? So we went there. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we did. And it was really embarrassing, though, because you had to get naked for the massage. And
was it? Can I interrupt? Was it a real massage, or a massage disguised as something else?
It was legit.
Okay.
So nothing illegal. It was a relaxing massage. But so we were in the changing room, and I was a bit like, I don't know what to do here. Like with, what's the deal of getting naked? Before I even had time to think, he was standing there butt naked. And I thought, right, okay, well, I suppose I'm going to have to do the same. Which, as I said, the other students were all really important partners and shareholders, and so was he. So it felt really strange to be standing there in a room naked with him, but then quickly put a towel round me. And we had these two beds next to each other. And like I said, it was a relaxing massage. It was quite good. And he kept trying to talk to me, and essentially I was supposed to be doing an English lesson at this point. But what I actually did was fall asleep, and then felt him then come up to me. I mean, he obviously was pretty laid back, so he wasn't particularly bothered. But so that was the lesson that we had together. And then had to go back again, get naked again, and then go back to work, and then sit down for 2 hours with one of his colleagues that was the most boring person in the world. And I was thinking, an hour ago, I was naked with your mates.
Did you ever think of that person in the same light again, or did that person sort of change in your estimation? Did you have a different opinion of him after that?
To be honest, I think he went up in my estimations, because I just thought he's just such a quality bloke, as we say, a great man, because he was just so laid back. He's just like, naked, yeah, sure, massage. Like, he just had a great attitude to life, which I thought was brilliant. So yeah, that's my story. And another one, which just very quickly to share, I've mentioned this one on the podcast before, about like classroom awkwardness. Not as awkward as a poo, I suppose. But when I did a lesson, it was about blind dates. And, so got to the end of the lesson. It was actually what is known in the industry as a jigsaw reading. So some people read one text, other people read another text, and then they talk about it. But the topic was a blind date. And then at the end I said, so has anyone ever been on a blind date? And someone put his hand up and said, yeah. I said, how was it? And then he just immediately said, brilliant. At the end of the night, we made sex. And again, it's that you think, should I correct the error and say it's actually we had sex? But I just instead just went, okay, thanks a lot. Well, that's the end of the lesson. Homework, page 53. See you all on Monday. Bye-bye.
Yeah, probably very wise.
Exactly.
Nice one. Now, the first story you told reminded me of a student who I was teaching privately, and I won't say which country it was in, but he was a member of the Air Force of that country, and he was a fighter pilot, and admitted to me during the lesson that he actively smoked marijuana before taking his plane up on a practice run. And I thought, my God, the things you learn in English classes, who would have thought the fighter pilots flying around stoned over this country? And I won't say which one it was, just in case there's people living there.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Wow, that's quite something to tell your English teacher. But that can happen sometimes when students confide things to you, and you kind of think, oh, wow, was not expecting that. But that's all fun and games, part of being an English teacher, I suppose.
Yeah. Hey, listen, before we go, Martin, can I quickly share a folk tale with you? Because I know that recently David Heathfield shared one, which I really liked on Rock and Roll English, and I'd like to share one to see what you think. It's very short.
Yeah. Okay.
You may have heard it. It's quite popular.
Okay.
So it's about two wolves. Okay. That's difficult for me to say. A wolf... WOLF, the plural is wolves with a V, that live inside us and they fight. And the folk tale is a Native American Indian folk tale where the grandfather of a Cherokee Indian tribe is speaking to his grandson, and he says to his grandson, I have a fight going on inside me. And the grandson says, what kind of fight, grandfather? And he says, well, there are these two wolves, and one is really evil. He's angry, he's arrogant, he's full of greed, full of lies, he has a huge ego, he's envious, and is full of false pride and superiority. And then there's a good wolf who is very peaceful, he's full of hope and love and kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth and compassion. And this same fight is actually going on inside of all of us. And the grandson says, which wolf will win, grandfather? And the grandfather says, the one that you feed.
Very nice.
I like that.
Very nice. Yeah, that's why I like these stories, because they often have that kind of message where, a message like that which can be delivered, and not even just stories, but even when you use like metaphors. I actually heard one the other day. This obviously isn't a story, but just as soon as I heard it, I just thought, wow, that made such an impact on me. Of when there are lots of problems in your life, you want to be like a rock in the sea. So you've got the sea where it's all rough and it's smashing against the rock, but the rock is just still, calm. And immediately when I heard that, I just thought, oh, that helped me so much. And like hearing your story there, it just has a message that you just think, a message often that you know, but it just helps you. It just reinforces something, like what we mentioned about also using pauses when you speak. It's something we already know, but when you hear that story or piece of advice, it really just reinforces it and helps you. So yeah, from listening to your story, then exactly that. Now I think, right, let's feed the good wolf.
Yes, let's go and feed the good wolf. Because,
exactly.
That would be a better world if everybody did that. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking, Martin. Before you go, because I would like this to come from you rather than me, can you tell listeners of Inlges Podcast where they can find your podcast, about your community? And I know you've got a course you're going to release soon about fluency, pronunciation and storytelling. Maybe tell them about that as well.
Yes, so the podcast, if you just type in Rock and Roll English, so that's rock and roll, so not rock and roll, Rock and Roll English into any podcast app, then you will find it. You can check out the website as well if you want, rockandrollenglish.com. As for social media, I have Instagram and Facebook. And there's a podcast community as well, but you can find that on the website. And for the course, that's something I'm starting very soon, and it's called Fluency via Pronunciation and Storytelling, because I really believe this is the way to help students. So pronunciation is something many teachers avoid because it's actually quite difficult to teach. And I myself did that for a long time, because I think when we qualify as English teachers, there's that course to do called the CELTA. It's not really a big thing on the course, so teachers just stay away from it. There's lots of strange symbols, but when I think you've mastered it, it makes you feel so much more confident. And with languages, confidence is such an important thing. So we look at pronunciation, the different sounds, and then sounds to words, words to sentences, and then obviously to fluency. And storytelling, because again, for all of the reasons we've just mentioned of how maybe when you perform a story, because in reality, every time you speak, it's a performance. But when you rehearse a story, you will learn more grammatical structures, more vocabulary, like we mentioned before, of including some of this vocabulary for effect. And the pride you get from the performance of telling a story for, let's say, 5 minutes, again, just has such a huge impact on your confidence. So that's what I want students to do. So that's going to be starting soon. So that's about me. But as this is going on my podcast as well, Craig, where can people find out more about you?
Well, to listen to our podcast, you can go to the website inglespodcast.com, or you can find us anywhere you listen to your podcasts, including Rock and Roll English. So that's really where I'd send people to go to listen to us, and it's been really, really fun. One final thing, because you said about pronunciation, I was thinking back to when I taught pronunciation. I used to teach it fairly regularly because there was consistency among the students. They would come every week or twice a week, and I could really spend time with the symbols and with connected speech and these pronunciation features. But then the school changed its policy, and we didn't always get the same students. There was no consistency, and I avoided it. As you just said, I avoided teaching it because it didn't make any sense. And in a course like yours, I really think it's a good idea that people sign up for it, because you'd have that consistency, and Martin will teach you those important things about pronunciation, and you can follow it from lesson to lesson and build on the knowledge. So I think it's a fantastic idea.
Yeah, thanks. Because like you said, the consistency is the important thing, because otherwise, if you just start writing these symbols on the board that people don't understand, then it's just a waste of everyone's time. So you really do need that consistent thing, and to start from the basics, like the sounds, to make sure you're pronouncing all of the sounds correctly, and then to build on that. So I totally agree.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for your time, Martin, and thanks for listening, everybody. And before you go, I've always wanted to say this: keep on rocking, baby. I've always wanted to say that. Fantastic.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Cheers, mate.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Okay, so that was Craig and me speaking about storytelling. And well done to Craig for being the first person ever to say keep on rocking. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Go to rockandrollenglish.com, click on podcast episodes, and find this episode to find all of the links to Craig's stuff. I will see you all very soon, people, but in the meantime, just keep on rocking, baby.
Thanks so much for listening to Rock and Roll English. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit rockandrollenglish.com and facebook.com/rockandrollenglish. We'll catch you next time.